Professor Alexander Kitroeff was born in Athens and educated in the United Kingdom, where he received his doctorate degree in modern history from the University of Oxford. He is currently professor of history at Haverford College in Pennsylvania and has taught at several other institutions. His research focuses on identity in Greece and its diaspora in a broad range from politics and sports, on which he has published extensively. His most recent books are The Greeks and the Making of Modern Egypt, 2019, and Greek Orthodoxy in America and Modern History, 2020. He is currently working on two book projects, A History of AHEPA, the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, to mark the organization's centenary in 2022, and A History of Greek-owned dinner restaurants in America. And as far as I know, Alexander Kitroeff just got back home from a trip to Cairo, where he was presenting his book about Greeks in Egypt.
That's right. It was I was in Cairo for the 53rd International Book Fair, which is held in Egypt's capital, and Greece was the honored guest. And there's a series of panels on Greek books, on Greek books that are translated in Arabic, on the cultural relations between the two countries. And the first panel was about my book on the Greeks in Egypt, which has been translated into Arabic. So it was a great occasion, great fun, and helped me warm up for this presentation, for which I thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be participating again. I've got a PowerPoint presentation to take us through what I want to talk about. So I'm going to share screen, get rid of everything else, and get this PowerPoint. Yes, it should be.
Perfect.
Yeah, great. Good. So I'd like to do two things, actually, in this presentation. I want to talk about the history of the Greeks in Egypt, but I thought, because this is a genealogy event, I wanted to talk about the way I learned about my own family history while I was researching the history of the Greeks in Egypt. My father's side of the family are Greeks from Egypt. So I was the first, after three generations in Egypt, I was the first to be born in Greece, because the Greeks were leaving Egypt in the 1950s because of the nationalist revolution that took place. So in a sense, it's my interest is both academic as well as personal. So these are the books I was talking about. At least the two on the right you can see. The first is a short monograph, which was based on my doctoral dissertation that I completed at Oxford University in 1984. And this book came out in 1989. And then by that time, I moved to the United States and shifted away from studying the Greeks in Egypt and was doing the studying the Greek Americans and other things. And then out of the blue, a few years ago, I was invited to write this overview of the history of the Greeks in Egypt. And I was delighted to accept. And the English book came out, and the Arabic translation has been published. And now there's a Greek one in the pipeline. The Greeks in Egypt are this, if we take the last 200 years of Greek history, 1821 to today, I think the two biggest and most important diaspora communities are the Greeks in Egypt in the 19th up to the early 20th century, and then it's the Greeks in the United States. So they're well worth studying, and that was, aside from my family roots, this was the other reason to study them, because they were an important community. They went to Egypt because of the cotton boom in Egypt, when the American Civil War happened and American cotton exports were limited because the North blockaded the ports of the South from where cotton was being exported, a lot of the slack was taken up by the production of an export of Egyptian cotton, which was very, very high quality. And it was what the British needed for their textile mills in Lancashire. I should note that cotton cultivation has not got the negative connotations that it has in the history of the United States, in the sense that, well, it wasn't much fun working on the cotton fields in Egypt, but this was not slave labor. It was agricultural workers who they were paid low wages, but there wasn't the stigma and the dark shadow of history that is on that we have with the history of cotton in the United States. That does not exist. It's celebrated in Egypt in many ways because it was an important way that the country entered modernity. The Greek presence in Egypt, and as I said, they're important in the 19th up to the early 20th. From the 1800s, they're invited to go to Egypt. These are the early Greek merchants. They're invited to go to Egypt to help the country's modernization, and they do so. They've got privileges like all foreigners. Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire gave privileges to foreign minorities. So the Greeks counted as foreigners in Egypt and had privileges, which meant that they were not taxed locally, and they had their own court system. So they didn't have to go to the Egyptian courts. Those two things were very, very important, of course, enabling a lot of commercial activity to go on freely and unencumbered. In 1882, the British take over Egypt. Egypt never becomes a British colony, but it's an informal possession of the British because the Egyptian economy had run into foreign debt because of high interest rates and bad local administration. So the British come in and take over directly from 1882 onwards. And are there in 1919. We have the rise of the Egyptian nationalist movement, which starts in 1919. It starts a bit earlier, but it takes on a mass movement from 1919 onwards, demanding independence, demanding the British go, and demanding that foreign privileges are eliminated. And the country goes through a period of gradual Egyptianization, with the British gradually loosening their control. And then in 1952 is the revolution in Egypt, the Nasser revolution, which will lead indirectly to the exodus of the Greeks, of most of the Greeks, not all of them. The Greeks are never expelled, but the country's economy, first of all, is Egyptianized and then nationalized. So a great deal of the private enterprise the Greeks were engaged in, they were unable to do so anymore. So most of them decided to leave. And now there are only a few thousands left in Egypt because not everyone left and the community survived. But the really big period is from the mid-19th to the 1950s. There was an extensive network of community organizations throughout Egypt, churches, schools, community organizations, orphanages, a full range of community organizations. And there, unlike the United States, where the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese is the most dominant institution, there in Egypt, it was the community, because the community was run by the wealthy cotton merchants. So they were able to in a sense, administer the churches as well as all the other institutions there in Egypt. And this little map of Egypt here is from a Greek geography book used in Greek schools in Egypt for the Greeks to learn about the geography of the country that they were in. And of course, significantly, a little bit like they did in the United States, the Greeks spread everywhere. They weren't only in Alexandria and Cairo, the two main cities, but went further south. Southern Egypt is called Upper Egypt, which is a little bit confusing, but in the small towns there, sometimes the Greeks were the only Europeans. And in many cases, the main store there was the Greek grocer. The presence of the Greek grocers was ubiquitous. There's a parallel between Greek-owned diners in the United States and Greek grocers in every town in Egypt during the period that we're looking at. The wealthy were very important. They were important for Egypt and Egypt's economy and also for Greece. Georgios Averof, a cotton merchant from Metsovo, was the wealthy donor of the Panathinaik Stadium that was constructed for the first Olympic Games in 1896. And he also, in his will in 1899, left enough money for Greece to acquire the battleship Averof. It's actually a dreadnought rather than a battleship. I mentioned this. If anyone's an expert, they're going to pull me up on that. But we call it the battleship Averof, το θωρηκτό Averof, which was one of the main reasons that Greece was victorious in the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, and expanded its territory so dramatically and significantly. The Averof was the dominant force in the Aegean. So that's something that the Greeks in Egypt contributed. Another important family was the Bernanke family. Along with other important cotton merchants, they contributed to the community organization in Egypt, and they also made contributions to Greece. The main figure in the Bernanke family, Emmanuel Bernanke, was very closely associated. He was a friend of Eleftherios Venizelos. And after Eleftherios Venizelos clashed with King Constantine in 1915 and created what is known as the Ethnikos Dichasmos, the national schism, the polarization between the Venizelists and the royalists in Greece that starts in 1915 and goes right through to World War II. When Venizelos was forced to resign after his clash with the king, he tours Egypt and visits. This is a visit he makes to the Bernanke, one of the Bernanke family houses. This is the person, you see, if you can see my cursor, this is Venizelos, and this person to Venizelos's left is Penelope Bernanke, who becomes Penelope Delta, one of the most famous literary figures of 20th century Greece. It's a sign of the closeness that the Bernanke family had with Venizelos. Bernanke, of course, goes on to become mayor of Athens and then becomes minister of agriculture with Venizelos. He moves from Alexandria to Athens to help Venizelos after he takes power, and he resumes power after the schism, and Emmanuel Bernanke is there at his side. When Emmanuel Bernanke dies in the late 20s, the Bernanke family decides to donate the family house, which is in downtown Athens, and the house is turned into a museum, which is across from the Greek Parliament. On it's a main cultural institution in Greece. And Bernanke's son Adonis was a collector of Islamic art, brings the art over to the Bernanke, and it's the core of what is now, of course, a very wide-ranging collection of Greek art and artifacts, and this is another contribution that the wealthy Greeks in Egypt make to Greece. So I was kicked out as I was talking about the Bernankes. So I'm going to share my screen and get back to I've moved on from the Bernankes. Aside from cotton, there was a range of other activities that the Greeks got involved in, because the wealth that the cotton created attracted many people from the rest of the Aegean Islands and Greece. And it's important to note that the Suez Canal that opened in 1869 was the work largely, not primarily, but largely, the Greek input was huge. Hundreds, thousands of Greeks left the Aegean Islands. These two little blue dots show the island of Kassos and Castellorizo. There were other people from Karpathos and other Aegean islands. They went right down to the canal and worked on the canal and helped the opening of the canal, and then settled in the canal area in those towns along the canal. In fact, the town right at the mouth of the canal, where the Mediterranean enters into the canal and goes down southward, is called Port Said. But before it was named Port Said, when the canal was opening, the people from Kassos had requested from Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French funder who had dreamt of the canal and made the canal become a reality. They asked him to name the town Nea Kassos, in honor of the many Cassiotes who had helped dig and open and administer the canal. But Lesseps said he couldn't do that because he had to name it Port Said, because the king of Egypt, the Khedive of Egypt at the time, was called Said, and he had to honor Said. Otherwise, it would have been extraordinary if the Suez Canal had the town at the opening of the canal was called Nea Kassos, but that never happened. Another aspect of the presence of the Greeks in Egypt was, of course, the huge literary production. The two main figures that we know, that everyone knows about, is Constantine Cavafy, who is, of course, a poet who's not only a great poet of Greece and the Greek diaspora, but is a poet of world renown. Stratis Tsirkas is also another figure. Two of them. There are many others. There was a huge Greek literary production as well in Egypt, which gave the community not only a kind of economic aspect, but also a very strong sense of intellectual richness and contributions. There were literary magazines in Egypt where Greek writers wanted to publish in the magazines that the Greeks in Egypt were producing. Finally, and this is the last one before I go on to my family history, Alexandria, the town on the Mediterranean, which had a huge Greek population, a very big European presence. The biggest European community were the Greeks. Renowned cosmopolitan life that started eroding only after Nasser's revolution in 1952. On the top left, you can see the famous Corniche, the seafront of Alexandria, and on the bottom right is the famous Stanley Beach, where all the Europeans used to go during not only the summer months to enjoy the Mediterranean. That's my little presentation of this important diaspora community: economics, intellectual life, geographical spread, participation in a very sophisticated European culture. My father's family was part of this environment, and I started learning things about them that I didn't know as I was researching the history of the Greeks in Egypt. My great-grandfather, Alexander Kitroeff, leaves the island of Chios and settles in Alexandria, where he marries Polyxeni Gavala, who has gone from the small island of Amorgos to Alexandria. And the family then settles in Alexandria. My grandfather was born there, so was my father. And as I said, I was the first to be born in Athens. These are the papers of my grandfather I found, and the most important in terms of the research of on the Greeks is the baptismal record, which exists at the Patriarchate of Alexandria. I wasn't looking at the actual certificate, the baptismal certificate, but I was looking at the books where all the baptisms were recorded, because they have wonderful, wonderful information. They've got the origins of both the father and the mother, and of the godfather sometimes, and their professions. So the baptismal records of the Patriarchate in Alexandria, for me, were important, because I found, I was able to locate my own family there, but also because one gets tremendously interesting data about the Greeks in Egypt. The one in the middle is his birth certificate. The birth certificate was from the municipality of Alexandria. This is a certificate that I found in my grandfather's papers, but I assume that if the municipality has records going back so far, this is 1903, one can find information. As you will notice, it's in Arabic and in French. And on the right is a lot of documents that the Greeks in Egypt brought with them when they left Egypt. Their companies gave them letters confirming the fact that they had served or they had worked in that particular company. This is the Associated Cotton Ginners of Egypt, and I have two copies of that, one in Arabic and one in English, which Greeks in Egypt have. They don't exist anywhere centrally, but families have these, and they attest to the economic activities of persons. Another source that I used both for the getting data and also for my own interest in my own family were the annually produced records, accounts of the community organizations, which I mentioned were the dominant communities. Those reports on the activities of the community have the members of the community, which were the executive board and the wealthy persons who were members of the community, and they also sometimes record all the donations other Greeks have. So the logodosies, these reports, are a wonderful source of, this is the town of Mansoura, which my family went through briefly, but there's also, of course, the Alexandria and Cairo community reports are very important sources of names and additional information. A lot of those reports were moved from the communities in Egypt to Athens, to an archive called the Hellenico Logotechniko και Ιστορικό Archeo. They were actually physically taken into the diplomatic bags of the Greek consulate and shipped over to Greece. And a lot of the community records are available in this archive in Athens. There's other archives where one can find things, especially the papers of these famous literary figures that I mentioned. And I was quite astounded to find that my great-grandfather had actually sent Cavafy a note, which appears in the Cavafy papers in the Onassis archive. Tsirkas's papers, the other writer I mentioned, his papers as well, which have got rich correspondence with people, are located in the Hellenico Logotechniko Historico Archeo. So we have these important personalities who have a lot of correspondence, and their archives help us find out not only their contacts, but we find out a lot of information about the people who were interacting with them. Despite the fact that a lot of stuff was moved from the community organizations of Cairo, Alexandria, and elsewhere to Athens in and around 1990, and this is something I found out during my recent visit in Cairo, there is a great deal of still archives remaining. There is a little compound. This is actually the compound. This is the Greek compound. This is what is left from the community of Alexandria. These are the old schools that the Greeks had, and now they are multi-use things. There's the Averofio Gymnasio, which is still a school. This is another school building that has become the community offices. This part has become the Greek consulate. There's a Greek club. There's another school. There's a gym. There is a place. There's a kind of place where guests are put up. This is a little compound right around here. As you can see, it's very central, near downtown Alexandria, near the Greek Orthodox cemetery, and near the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, the new version of the famous Alexandria Library. What is going to happen to those records is actually unknown, but it's something now that I think those of us interested in recording the history of the Greeks in Egypt are anxiously trying to find out ways of preserving and somehow digitizing and storing those important archives. Everyone thought that most things had been moved in 1990, but it appears that there's still a lot of stuff in these buildings in this Greek compound. However, it's not going to be easy, and this is my final slide. It's not going to be easy because I had a piece in this week's National Herald about our conference, and I described genealogy being as something that Americans are interested in. The Greeks in Egypt are not so much interested in genealogy because they have this information, or they feel they have it. They may have better access to it. So they're engaged mostly in activities which have to do with remembering their history. There's a great deal of nostalgia. They all loved Egypt. There were very close relations between the Greeks and the Egyptians. So the important association of Greeks from Egypt, which exists in Athens, and which has got it's an important venue for a lot of activities. Most of those activities are nostalgia. It's the historians who are interested in the genealogical stuff, but we're going to get our acts together and try and preserve as much as possible. And that is, and try and get the Σύνδεσμος Αιγυπτιωτών Ελλήνων to help us with this project. And with that, those are the Greeks in Egypt for you. And thank you for the opportunity to present them to you.
Thank you for this great presentation, Alexandre. I have a question.
Sure.
So it was great that you gave us the historical context of the Greek community in Egypt, and then your more personal family experience. In your work, how do you balance the two? So the emotional load from your family, as opposed to the more objective stance that you have to keep.
It's an issue. It's helpful because I get better access to archives, because I am considered an Aegyptiotis origins-wise, and a lot of people are very sensitive about the way Greek historians are going to treat the Greeks in Egypt, because the Greeks in Egypt had privileges. So many people are worried that they might be seen as people who benefited from colonialism. The Greeks were actually in between colonialism and the Egyptians, but there's a sensitivity about how outsiders will view the history. So that gives me a That gives me great access. And then, of course, I say, well, I'm origin. I was born in Athens, so I am, and I'm a historian, and that enables me to get away with some types of criticism, maybe that others don't involve. But this is a wonderful question, and I'm answering it with a smile. But it's a balancing act, and it's something I'm always aware of and wonder, am I being the historian now, or am I, is it the emotional stuff? And, I think as long as you can try and mobilize both to write history and convey information, I think that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Besides, there's something personal in every story that Absolutely. Okay, well, if you need any help with preserving the archives of the Greek community in Egypt, you can count on us. You know that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.